Thanks, Arun. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to introduce you to a study that was a 2-year study, and we're starting the next phase of the work. I want to acknowledge the leadership of Diane Grunick as well, because of a lot of the technology that we've worked with that meets the topic of today's discussion was sponsored by Diane and the Public Utilities Commission. So California has been a leader in demand response policy and demand response automation, and we'll be talking about something called the California Potential Study. Actually, before I leave the slide, I should say there's a very large team here. So you'll see Lawrence Berkeley National Lab staff, E3, I'll talk a little about the modeling work that E3 did, and Nexent. So the main thing that we're talking about is over the next 10 years, what does the electric grid look like in California, and how can customer loads help us manage more renewables on the grid? So that's what this study was exploring. So you've all seen the duck curve. This is a picture that shows you some of the problems that the duck curve presents. This ramping in the morning and the late afternoon, the minimum generation. We have overgeneration in the middle of the day. We have this evening peak, which is growing. And we have intra-hour variability and short-run duration and ramps. So essentially what we're seeing is that the demand response history in California has been addressing hot summer days. We had blackouts and brownouts when we had Enron here, and we had the investment in something called prices to devices. We spent $6 billion putting in smart meters. And we were supposed to use the home area network as our gateway to send prices to your thermostats and your appliances. But we're not there yet. We still have a long way to go, but we do believe that demand response is one of the things to help us manage the electric grid, and we're going to explain how demand response can do that. So the study was funded by the Public Utilities Commission. And it had a large team, and the basic question was, what demand response service types will meet California's future grid for clean energy, and what's the size and the cost of the demand response? So the size and the cost relates to some sort of supply curves. I'm going to show you how we develop supply curves for demand response. There's a long tradition in energy efficiency to develop supply curves. Alan Meyer at Berkeley was one of the first people who developed supply curves for energy efficiency, and they're now often referred to as the McKinsey curves, where we can look at cost of conserved energy, but now we're looking at cost of conserved carbon, and in the future we're going to be looking at grid services in that framework, and here we have kilowatts and kilowatt hours in some of these supply curves. So what we did in this study was we defined 4 grid services. And we use these terms, shape, shift, shed, and shimmy. These terms are to represent things that we want to do with a customer load shape. First of all, the shape, and I'll describe this in more detail. We want to shape the customer's load with prices. We want to shift load. So we want to be able to use more during the belly of the duck and flatten the duck. Some people say make it a halibut. Some people say teach the duck to fly. And there's also the dragon curve, which maybe some of you have seen. So we have all kinds of animals on the grid now. So it's a zoo. And we want to shed load. That's the traditional hot summer demand response. And then the shimmy. The shimmy is what we do when Steph Curry scores a lot of points. Maybe some of you saw him last night. But it's in the grid, we call it the ancillary services. So this is fast demand response, and we need those loads. And what you're going to see in my sort of executive summary is we need a lot of this, we need more of this, we need less of this, and we need some of this, but we don't need as much of it. It's worth a lot, but we don't need as many megawatts. So that's my executive summary. We need a lot of shift. And we're working with the PUC on something called the Load Shift Working Group. And the other story, a lot of you know, is electrification. How does California think about our electric loads over the next decade or two? And we're going to see that rolling out as the policy debate meets the technology and the economics for the customers. So this is what those shapes look like. This is the megawatts and the hour of day. And a shed is typically a hot summer day demand response event. So that is the traditional DR we've been doing for several decades, and most of the DR in California is around hot summer demand response. That's the demand response we pay for today. That's not the demand response we need because we have plenty of capacity. Over here is what shift looks like, and we modeled shift. We did not model what's called reverse demand response or take demand response. We're starting to see some utilities pay people to use more electricity. And in Arizona, they're thinking about having people heat their swimming pools in the winter because they have too much solar. So they're looking for loads. It's load building. So those of us involved in the electric grid for many years know that load building and energy efficiency have been sort of a challenge. So the future is decarbonization and electrification, but what those shapes look like and what those services are matter a lot. So we decided to model shift instead of take, and I'll talk a little about how we did that. So loads that have storage are really good examples of shift. Lighting does not have shift, but thermal loads do, water heaters do. We did not model water heaters because we don't have a lot of electric water heaters, but we may in the future. This is my super off-peak tariff here. This is one of the favorite things about this study is that if we can get prices to devices and send you a price when there's plenty of solar on the grid, we want people to use more electricity in the day and less around dinner time. And I'll go through some examples of that. This is one of the most important policy challenges for California is how to have the right tariffs and then automate TOU. It may be a critical peak price, but this is a tariff you're going to see every day. And in most of California, PG&E, Edison, San Diego, they have these hourly meters now. And this is sometimes referred to as matinee pricing. Go to the movies early, get a discount, do your washing machine and your dishwasher before 4 p.m. and it'll be cheaper. Not at night. See, this is lower than the nighttime. So historically, thermal storage, we charge things at night. You have a great heating and cooling plant here, and we might think about what you can do with this pricing. But you don't see this pricing yet, and Palo Alto probably doesn't even offer it. And I know you don't buy directly from them as well. So prices are complicated. But this is the basic idea, is that we're moving towards a future where we see these prices, and we want to start automating time of use so that your dishwasher can talk to Alexa, and then your systems can listen to prices from the grid. And over here, this is what we call shimmy. Shimmy is a fast-acting loads. They can go up and down. A variable frequency drive, actually on an HVAC system, can provide shimmy as well as HVAC services. And a pool pump can do this. There's a lot of variable frequency drives on industrial loads. Large municipal pumping can provide these shimmy services. So what we did in our study was we modeled these shed, shift, shimmy, and shape. And these are the current demand response products and how they relate to the California market. I'm not going to go through all the details of that, but I wanted to let you know that we simplified the terminology because describing actually what's on the market today, flexible resource adequacy, emergency demand response, ancillary services, non-spin, we lumped these things into these various categories. And we modeled all of the customers in the PG&E, Edison, and San Diego territory to explore whether they could provide these services to the grid. So what we did in the study was we developed a set of supply curves, and I'm going to show you exactly how we did that. This is the levelized unit cost of demand response in kilowatts per year. And this little bit here is the shape response. Now, here is the quantity or the gigawatts per year of shed. We did two different approaches. So these supply curves, I'm going to explain to you how we estimated how much demand response is available on the market today. And then we used a price reference approach. So this one up here, if you were to build a combustion turbine, it would be about $200 a kilowatt. So anything less than that turbine is cost effective for demand response for those top 250 hours. Now those top 250 hours is where you get something called resource adequacy payments. and the utilities can pay customers for those resource adequacy demand response. When we look at those top 100, 250 hours in 2015 and over to 2025, we actually start to see some of those hours in January. So the top 250 hours are today, hot summer days, but with the ducts happening every month over the next decade, we see some of those top hours in the winter. So we're seeing a very different grid as we have more renewables, and now with Title 24, we even see more photovoltaics are going on those rooftops. This bottom approach for the system levelized value, we used E3's resolve model, and we ran a simplified production cost model, and we said, how is demand response dispatched in an economic model of the grid? And when we ran that demand response against bringing on more capacity on the grid continuously over the year, it has 37 prototypical days, we determined the value of demand response by running it within a grid dispatch model. So we used those methods, and that's where we saw, since there's a lot of capacity in California for hot summer DR, the demand response, the hot summer DR is not worth a lot of money, but that shift that I was talking about, because we need every day when we see ducts, we have that ramping need every day, and we have more and more over generation hours. So that's the nature of the study. Looking in more detail here, again, that price reference approach, number one, this is where we see the generator, and we see a horizontal demand curve for shed, and we estimated the range of gigawatts of demand response that's available in the market today. And then the resolve model gives us these different curves, and I'll describe how we did those resolve models. The study used over 200,000 electric load shapes from the utilities. So we were able to get data from San Diego Gas and Electric, Pacific Gas and Electric, and SoCal Edison. And we basically recreated the entire load shape of those three utilities. And we used 11 million demographic files from the customers to create clusters that represented, for example, residential coastal or residential inland or small commercial coastal. So we had the 16 climate zones. We did this study by sublap. So we could look at what demand response is available in the peninsula or in Palm Springs. And we basically recreated the hourly load shapes. And then we forecasted to 2020 and 2025 with the Integrated Energy Policy Report. So we looked at how is electricity changing over the next 10 years? What kind of electric vehicles are we going to see? What kind of solar and wind? And I'll show you some of the net load curves. Then we took what's called demand response path, which is an LBL tool that looked at the adoption of technology based on the current demand response programs and estimating what it would look like to incentivize people to adopt technology. And that's where the study is. It's not a technical potential. We don't turn off every load, but we say, what do we know about the participation in demand response? And I'll give you some examples of that. And then, as I mentioned, the resolve model, which is benchmarks for avoided investment in operation costs, and we modeled when demand response was available. So we had a high and a low renewable curtailment levels. So these were the pieces of the model where we took the hourly loads, we forecasted 10 years into the future, we did both a typical year and a hot year, and of course there's more demand response on a hot year, and we looked at possible pathways for the demand response potential. Now these are the clusters that we had. So we had about 500 clusters for the residential sector, and the clusters had, on average, median, about 10,000 customers in each cluster. Some of them actually had 56,000. So we took the hourly data from the 200,000 load shapes and the 11 million demographic files. The 11 million demographic files had total annual energy use. So the model is calibrated to the total energy use in 2014. We modeled commercial buildings, industrial loads, and then some other, and we ended up with about 3,600 clusters. These hourly load shapes are actually public. So if there are researchers and students that want to be looking at hourly load shapes, these are public data sets. we anonymized them, and the CPUC allowed us to release these clusters. So these are hourly load shapes from 2014. And our bottom-up evaluation of what demand response is available from these customers is based on these 3,600 clusters. Okay, so what demand response did we model? We modeled behind-the-meter batteries, battery electric vehicles and plug-ins, residential air conditioning. We modeled both direct load control and smart thermostats. The biggest load in California that's called on a hot summer day is air conditioning. So SoCal Edison has a very large direct load control capability, and they automate air conditioner load control on hot summer days. They'll call you about 10 to 15 times, and they'll get a gigawatt from curtailing residential air conditioning. It is not price responsive. It's direct load control. Smart thermostats that receive prices, or these, what do they call it, rush hour rewards. Nest and Ecobee and Honeywell offer thermostats that are subsidized by the utilities, and you can participate in a rush hour rewards program and save money on your bill if you participate in those programs. Pool pumps. Pool pumps are, in Southern California, there's more than up here, but a residential pool pump is a great example of a load that has to run 8 hours a day, but the 8 hours it runs is flexible. So you could actually run it and get some shift from that load. And in the future, we're going to see loads listening to signals from the grid and doing the shape of their load that's based on responding to prices and other grid signals. Commercial, we did energy management systems, HVAC, lighting, and refrigerated warehouses. We've done a lot of studies that show refrigerated warehouses are excellent types of technologies where they can sub-freeze frozen food. That is a better load than refrigerated food, because you don't want to freeze the lettuce, but you can actually sub-freeze the fish and chips. Industrial process, we did large industrial process. These are the major source of the base interruptible programs today that are available for grid emergencies. Agricultural pumping, a lot of interest in combined telemetry that has the power for the pumps as well as moisture sensors to see what kind of pumping is needed and to have dispatchable agricultural pumping. Data centers have storage and temperature flexibility, and then wastewater treatment and pumping. So these exist today. These have all participated in demand response, and what we did was we looked at how much megawatts and kilowatt hours are available from these different loads. In the study, we did what was called a business as usual, accelerated progress, and a very high, fast process in order to estimate, to give some range, because we took the medium accelerated progress. If we had policies in place where customers were incentivized to join programs and the programs were persistent. Our biggest concern here is that there's not a lot of persistence of savings because the programs change so much. So that's one of our challenges, is the utilities may pay for something to be installed, but the programs have been changing. We have something called bifurcation, and a lot of the demand response that was normally at the retail level is now bid into the wholesale market. So the markets are still in flux, and that's one of the biggest challenges. So we looked at the cost to install the demand response, how many kilowatts are available, and what was the propensity for customers to adopt. This is the big behavior question here. We actually did some manual demand response, but we tried to model a sort of wide variety of scenarios to understand how much demand response is actually available. This is what I mentioned earlier about the matinee pricing. This blue over here is the price that SoCal Edison in the spring, in the middle of the day, when the duck curve is the worst, is giving you a price discount. Super off-peak is not at night, super off-peak is the middle of the day. So that is a very new a challenge for dynamic loads is to use more here and then less at dinner time. And we've modeled a variety of tariff options from both Edison and PG&E. So I'm now going to talk to you a little about how we did the actual work. We basically estimated the quantity of demand and response available from the control systems, and I mentioned this automation technology, the market participation and the incentive levels, and then the model would sweep through a range of price ceilings, and it would choose the highest quantity of DR at each cluster. So this is a very bottom-up model. Basically, we had data on the cost to install all the technologies, the cost to maintain them, and the cost for customer incentives. So the model has a tree structure like this, and here's an example. Customers in Ventura with HVAC and lighting, they might have a programmable communicating thermostat or direct load control, and then we would look at what the adoption data were, and we would come up with how many kilowatts at what price. So this is the basis of the supply curve, is this sort of tree structure that the model explores. And it ends up looking like a supply curve where, again, this is the cost per kilowatt per year. So this is an annualized cost. Typically, the measures we estimated would be in place for about 10 years, and this is the gigawatts. So here, we might have 5 gigawatts available under $200 a kilowatt. So that's essentially what we want to do, is say, how much does it cost to go out and get the demand response? Now, the resolve model is a model in which we look at the high curtailment future and a low curtailment future. The purpose of the model is to develop a repeatable, open, transparent methodology for us to value the demand response, and the demand response has different value based on the future grid conditions. So when we have more high curtailment future, there's more behind the meter photovoltaics, would increase curtailment and the DR value, and then represented by the high behind the meter photovoltaics. And then in other low curtailment, we have more wind, less PV, and a lower value for the DR. So the value of the DR depends on the scenarios that we see in the future, but this gives us an idea of the policy that we're investing in now. And right now, the Public Utilities Commission is using Resolve to do an integrated resource plan for the next 10 to 15 years, and we're adding our shift data directly into their integrated resource plan. So if you think about the grid, and you want to decarbonize it, you want more renewables, but you have to have this demand response. Your option against the demand response is more batteries, which is much more expensive than the demand response. We did model behind the meter batteries, but we also want to make sure people understand the lowest hanging fruit for the grid is to engage with customer loads. This is a graph that shows the marginal dollars per megawatt hour shifted savings and the percent shifted daily. And this is sort of what I just told you, is this demand response has more value in future years. And the two colors here are the different amounts, the different years, and the percent shiftable daily hourly load. So there's a lot of value to have just a little bit of shift. And we can get that shift from those tariffs I showed you. So if we can get people to use more in those middle of the day and less at night. What I'm going to show you also, what we're looking at now is this load shift working group and how to define shift, because California spent 2 to 3 decades doing hot summer demand response, but we actually don't know how to incentivize and pay for shift. So in my last few slides, I have a little bit of that for you to see as well. So this is what a shift supply curve looks like. And this one is actually in kilowatt hours, not in kilowatts, and the cumulative available demand response in gigawatt hours per day. In the potential study, in the last phase, we did this annualized, and right now we're redoing these for the PUC by season. And I'm going to show you some of the seasonal numbers, because as many of you know, the duck curve is a spring phenomena. But how bad is summer? Summer, when you have more air conditioning load, it's not as bad, but we still see more ducks. And in winter, we see a duck because we still have some cooling load. And with space heating and water heating, we're going to try to rebuild these curves to estimate more electrification. So we're seeing many cities have something called 80 by 50. They're trying to reduce their greenhouse gases by 80% by 2050. In order to do that, they're going to have to electrify, space heat, and water heat, because the natural gas that we use in our homes is a much bigger polluter than the rest of our end-use loads because our grid has gotten so clean. That's not true in other parts of the country, but it's true for California. So oops, I think I went the wrong way here. So I have here about 2 gigawatt hours. Now, this word shapeshift, so shift is a service that we get from shifting the load, but if you're using prices, we call it shape shift or shape shed. So you can get some shifting just from the shape, and we can get 10 to 20 gigawatt hours that's cost effective. 2 to 5% of the daily load is shifted, and you'll see back here that has a lot of value. Just a small amount of that shift is going to help us flatten that duck. Because remember, we're using more in the day and then less around dinner, and that's the ideal time to shift. And thermal loads, air conditioners can do that, pool pumps can do that, EVs can do that. So we're looking at what loads are available to do those kinds of services. This is what shift technologies are, and I'm going to show you, this is commercial HVAC, industrial process, industrial pumping. These colors here, refrigeration, batteries. So if batteries were cheaper, we could do a lot of this with behind-the-meter batteries. Tesla Powerwalls, $5,000. You can get them at Home Depot now. You may have trouble siting them. I heard a story in Fontana. It took them longer to site the battery to install it at the house than to build the house, because the local code officials are trying to figure out what does it mean to have this battery. And if we think about fire and PG&E turning off the grid, you might want that battery, but that battery could start the fire. So we actually have big challenges as we think about the role of batteries. Demand response is the first thing you do. Get a smart thermostat, put your pool pump on a machine that's listening to prices, charge that EV correctly, and do the low-cost things before you buy the battery. The battery's a good idea. I'm a supporter of it, but they're going to be expensive, and they're going to cause other fires. So this is the most important slide from a technical perspective of the results of the study. So we saw that shape gives us about a gigawatt of shed. So on a hot summer day with time of use prices, we suppress air conditioners with those prices. So we can get a gigawatt of reduction. Now, California uses about 50 gigawatts, so that gives you some idea. I'll show you some of the curves in a moment. 2 gigawatt hours of shift at zero cost. So if we can get these prices to your thermostat, and it's not as hot in Palo Alto as the rest of the state. We don't have air conditioners as much here, but in a lot of the state, throughout the year, that's a pretty big number. Shed. Generation overbuild means zero need for system level shed. We have plenty of capacity. Capacity is not the problem. The problem is the shape. So we need to shift. So we can get 2 to 10 gigawatts of cost-effective shed. And the most interesting thing, which I'm going to show you in a moment, is half of the shed is in areas that are locationally constrained. So while we have this demand response at the system level, it's the local value of shed allows you to defer upgrading the local distribution system. So the value of shed, if you can get people to use less on a hot summer day, is good locally. But at the transmission level, we have capacity. It can be capacity constrained. I'll talk about that in a second. Shift, 10 to 20 gigawatt hours of cost-effective shift, 2 to 5% of daily load. This is like take your daily medicine, and you get it's about $500 million a year of value. So $500 million from helping to manage the grid if we can get that shift resource working. So that's valuable to the consumer. It makes the system more cost effective if we're using customer loads to manage the duck curve. Shimmy's the fast demand response for ramping, load following, and reg up and reg down. About 300 megawatts is what we need. Worth only about $25 million a year. The cost per megawatt is higher, but we don't need as many megawatt hours. So some of those very fast VFDs, Steffes water heaters, and even batteries can provide these services. But the big takeaway is the value is here at $500 million a year with the shift capability. So I mentioned that 50% of the shed that we modeled is in capacity-constrained areas. LA Basin, San Diego, Ventura, those are areas where the utilities are looking at a lot of load growth. So if we can actually shed there, that's where there's value. We are figuring out how to pay for and value local demand response, local DER. So that's one of the next things for California, is moving beyond the system level to the sub-lab, to the locational value of these distributed energy resources. And these demand response resources are part of that calculus. So this slide here is where we're currently at in California. The Public Utilities Commission has established a series of working groups that are trying to define shift. The way demand response works is that the utilities call events and the demand response is measured and it's settled against some baseline. We're trying to figure out how to make shift dispatchable or permanent. It could be either, but dispatchable has more value because the solar resources are dynamic. But how do we create a baseline for a shift? And that's one of our challenges, is the baselines and defining what actually shift means. So we're working with these working groups, developing products, a shift product, so you can pay a customer for shift resources, develop a capacity value, develop resource adequacy, develop a proposal on how to coordinate with CAISO. CAISO is currently paying batteries for shift, but not loads. That's the whole point of the study. And we're working on, by 2019, to have a new set of products available in California that pays for this shift resource. So this picture here is what those ducts look like. This is pretty new. It's not published yet. Over here are the colors. This is winter, spring, summer, and fall. And you can see the white duct curve, which is the net load. So we basically created all the hourly loads for the next 10 years each day. And you can see here, in summer, for example, we have a high HVAC load. Let me also orient you. This is 30 gigawatts. This is a little higher than 30. This is about 40 gigawatts, and here's a 30 again. So summer, we still see a duct curve. And we see what end uses are available that are potentially dispatchable. We see the process loads, pumping, refrigeration, pool pumps, EV charging. So this is one of the EV charging is one of the big questions. EV charging here shows EV charging, mostly people charge their EVs when they get home. California has a very aggressive goal for more EVs. That's going to make the duct curve worse unless we figure out the charging. So the ideal charging would be more workplace charging. And that means I talked to some office building owners who are like, well, it's a new load. I'm going to have to pay for that load. So we don't have the incentives right. So we have to figure out some way to have this new load at work, but incentivize the commercial building owners or the retail or public charging stations that have free electricity. I know in Texas they have free electricity at certain times. So you could imagine, I know, I think it was at Walmart or one of the retail, Target was gonna give people free EV charging in order to get them to come shop at their store. So there's some interesting policy issues about EV charging. This blue load here is probably gonna grow. But we're starting to peel away those end-use load shapes by season, which we didn't do in the previous phase of the project, and understand how the seasonal loads impact the duct curves and the grid resources. So I want to make a couple of comments about where we're heading. And the challenge in the electricity space is the energy efficiency we've been doing for the last 2 or 3 or 4 decades has been very successful, but we're moving from a time of static energy efficiency to dynamic energy management. And we have, the good news is, the Internet of Things and our ability to collect data, use machine learning, and control things is improving. So we are very interested in something called model predictive control. Today we have PID loops on our HVAC systems. we want model predictive control, but what we really want are adaptive, grid-aware, model predictive control for buildings and communities. So one of the challenges with more distributed energy resources is not at the building scale, but it's at the community scale. So we may want groups of buildings to be on a cluster, so each building is not just talking to the grid, but that there's distributed energy resources at the community scale. And if we have these models that are running as part of the control system, you can help manage energy, integrate with the grid, conduct fault detection, and respond to occupants. So there's an Internet of Things agenda where you take the data from the building, collect the sensors, run an optimization, and try to run the building to both reduce energy use and to interact with the grid and to predict the storage capabilities that are inherent in the building loads. That's one of the things we want to do. And this is what it looks like. So that today, we care about security, we care about productivity, we care about health, and we have lights and HVAC and plug loads. Now we have to interact with the vehicle charging, with the microgrid, with the campus, and with the grid. So we're moving to a time when the building has to be part of a larger IoT infrastructure. And exactly what those boundaries are and who owns and operates it, I haven't talked a lot about aggregators, but somebody's to be profiting from the investment of these transactive platforms. You here with your district heating and cooling system, we're looking not only at transactive electric systems, but transactive thermal grids. So there's a data center in Seattle where the data center next to the Amazon headquarters sells heat to the Amazon building, and it's not an Amazon data center. So the Amazon building buys heat from the building next door, waste heat from the data center. And it's an example where two buildings together can use less than one building would alone. So we're moving to a time where it's not about just using less energy, it's about transacting with other buildings around you and with a dynamic grid. So this is my last slide, just a little bit of a summary. So one of the things that we haven't talked about in a lot of detail, but that you see there is we need more storage on the grid. The storage can be within the building. It can be the thermal loads, the air conditioning, the mass. It can be EVs, new automation and Internet of Things, monetized distribution services. But the wild card is how all these things fit together. They are technically capable of providing these services, but the business models to deploy this kind of technology is a challenge for us. This new concept of shift, it differs from shed, dispatched, and it's difficult to measure and pay for. So there's a lot of interest in California on figuring out how to deploy this shift capability. I mentioned that the shimmy markets are thin, but could be energy neutral if their key elements combined with portfolios with other distributed energy resources. So again, a pool pump, a variable frequency drive, a storage water heater can provide some of these shimmy services. One thing I didn't tell you was in the study, we used telemetry systems that vary depending on the grid service. So if you're just getting prices, it could be a slow telemetry where you're sending prices, but for the shimmy, you need 4-second telemetry, which the CAISO requires on some of the more advanced grid services. So we have different requirements for the different systems and different price points. But one of the most important things is the next phase of our work is going to consider more electrification. And so here we're getting not only to how do we use electricity today, but how do we become a low-carbon society? And to become a low-carbon society, we have to electrify space heat and water heating. And that means when you put in an electric water heater in your home, you can put a resistance heater or you can put a heat pump water heater. If you put in a resistance heater, people really like to transact that because there's a lot of kW. But the heat pump water heater is much more efficient. So I'm more of an advocate for doing efficiency first, but the loading order is being turned on its head. The loading order in California means you do all the efficiency before you do the DR, before you do the solar and the PV. But we're really in this world where California's trying to figure out what its goals are. And the state is looking at Title 24, which, as you saw in the news, they're now going to require photovoltaics on future homes. And there are some demand response requirements, and there are several assembly bills that are considering, instead of Title 24 being an energy efficiency standard, it's going to be a carbon standard. So that it would require space heat and water heat to be electrified. That's very controversial, potentially expensive. So we have to decide how fast we want to invest into decarbonization. And this is an example of some of the subtleties that it takes when we get to those kinds of questions. So I'm going to stop there and answer questions.
Thank you, Maria. Just following tradition, let's open it up for the students first. We have some time for a few questions. The students get to go first. Any student? Yes.
Okay, so in your experience, which policies are the most effective to improve demand response?
Dynamic pricing. So time of use is one, critical peak pricing would be another, real-time pricing would be even better, which I didn't really mention RTP, but we really should have hourly pricing for large customers and be sending them day-ahead hourly pricing so they could optimize against an hourly load shape for prices.
Do you expect that to happen at the utility?
Well, SoCal Edison has a temperature-triggered RTP, and their customers are pretty happy. So if you're a flexible load and you're not weather sensitive, if you're an office building, it might be harder because you use more on those hot days. Do I expect it to happen? What do you think, Diane? Do you expect it to happen? It's been an uphill battle. If you ask Severn Bornstein, he'll tell you why it should happen, but it has been difficult because utilities don't like it. In Georgia, they have two-part RTP where every customer has a baseline, and you only pay for a dynamic price over your baseline. So that's a possibility. So there's a lot of different tariffs, but we're not very creative.
I guess sort of a question and a half. I guess you just brought up an example very early on about Arizona paying for swimming pool heating
Right.
Off of the solar supply. Solar strikes me as an example where, my apologies if I'm just behind, but it doesn't strike me that having less demand would make energy production particularly less efficient. Like you might take in some sort of efficiency hit from the utilities perspective. I don't understand quite how it's costing them to have less demand.
Right. That's a really good question, and I should have said. California had a couple hours last spring where we were 50% solar. And so you probably know when you have a lot of renewable energy on the grid, you have to pay other resources to firm it. So you're still running backup generation just to firm the grid. If you can use demand response to firm grid, it's much cheaper. So when you have capacity like all of their solar, but it only runs so many hours, they're making more money if they can actually sell more hours because they have that capacity. So that's two different elements of the answer.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering about the valuation of demand response services and how to incentivize. Specifically, I think today the demand response services are a lot valued in terms of capacity, but not so much in terms of energy.
That's right.
However, you pointed out that shifting is really valuable for the system.
Yep.
Do you think there can be other policies that would kind of incentivize shifting more, or can these capacity values incentivize shifting?
Right. Well, that is what this group is trying to do, is to think about what a product would be to measure and pay for, to offer it, to measure it, and to pay for shift. The hot summer DR, which is maybe 40 hours, is a lot easier to settle for the utilities. But how many hours do we need this? We think we needed a lot of hours. Should it just be permanent load shifting? Maybe. Permanent load shifting might be, right now we'll pay for ice or chill water or something like that, which is actually storing at night. So we haven't quite figured it out yet. It's a good question, though.
You mentioned the sort of district opportunities at the smaller scale, but not household or business. In other words, sharing locally. And I'm wondering if that's happened with rooftop solar anywhere where there's an example that's played out.
Yeah.
A local microgrid market just for rooftop solar
Yeah.
has been established? Because it's always seemed to me that, you know, one of the problems with giving people retail rates for the rooftop solar is that, you know, if it's going to go into the big grid, it's going to be expensive to merchandise.
Yeah.
But I can see where you could pay retail for your neighbor's solar or the guy down the street. I'm wondering, if the problem is that PG&E's not in that business, or at least is not currently in that business. How do you see that actually playing out? Are there any examples that have been played with?
It's a really good question, and I'm not really an expert on community scale solar, but I do think that there are ways you can buy into a local co-op. I think we're going to start to see more of that. And exactly what those models are, I don't know. In Oakland, there's something called the Oakland Eco Block, which is a Berkeley LBNL effort to retrofit a block of homes with PV, EVs, and instead of electric storage, they have 2 flywheels. So there are designs, and that is an all-in sort of, those homes are going to be dramatically altered in order to be part of a community scale microgrid. And PG&E is allowing it as a research project, but not as a scaled business model. So it's a good question, and I'd like to know myself.
Is there any plan for allowing an EV owner to, say, drive to work, plug the car in, and have the bill for the charging go to the EV owner's home bill, as opposed to having to pay every day, or to have any other alternative for charging the EV during the sunny period of the day?
Right. So, you know, there are many vendors, like ChargePoint is one. So it may be that the office building owner would have commercial vendors, and they wouldn't actually own the charging stations. So there are certainly models like that. It wouldn't go to their bill, but it would go to a third party that they would subscribe to.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. You said
Yeah.
there are Nest thermostats that allow the Nest to know what the home needs.
Right.
Is there a way to use the Internet of Things to identify the vehicle that's charging and say, don't bother to bill the commercial site, but
Right.
instead bill the home bill?
I think, yeah, I think it's easy to do. It's a scale issue. So, you know, I mean, I don't know what's the charging infrastructure like here in Stafford? We could talk about that if ChargePoint. So, yeah, so you're basically paying ChargePoint, not Stanford, but it shows up on Stanford's load shape. So exactly how those business transactions work, I actually don't know.
Last question.
Well, there are 2 real quick ones. Since you are very much an expert in demand response, first one is, do you see other areas of the country or internationally that are really starting to embrace it? And second, do you have any quick statements or observations about in California the impact of community choice aggregation,
Yeah.
which is really going to be breaking up rate design,
Yep.
procurement, distribution,
Yep.
and sort of my concern is the value of all this gets so lost
Yep.
as we're starting to fragment.
Right. So in terms of other states, there's a lot of demand response in Hawaii. Hawaii is probably more similar to us, and they are curtailing solar. They are using OpenADR, so they're probably more like us than anywhere. We now have Jenny Potter, who was an author on the study, who's a commissioner in Hawaii, so we're influencing somebody to the west of us. Certainly in PJM, the demand response is fairly different. You're probably aware of that as well. So that's one of the challenges is around the country, because the electricity markets are different, the DR is a little different. Texas, certainly there's a lot of DR as well. Texas is wind. They don't have the duck curve, but they actually have multi-day storage issues, different than this. So you know, the type of storage problems we see depend a little bit on the electric mix, and our PV dominated is more like Hawaii. So let's see, your other question was? CCAs are so difficult for this. The reason is, and I asked PG&E recently, PG&E has automation systems where they can send dynamic critical peak price to customers and send a price to, using OpenADR, to automation systems. CCAs, whose automation system are they going to be? Can they send the prices to the customers? And how does the customer understand these new demand response programs? So my initial fear was they will do the TOU periods, but maybe not the absolute price is the same. Critical peak pricing, no CCA has done critical peak pricing yet, So how the CCAs are part of the demand response is a big issue, and I haven't seen anybody talk about it.
There's a chance that they can hire a third party.
An aggregator. Yeah. Yeah.
It's complete, and they can bring them in and minimize the cost for the
They could. We haven't seen them do that yet. So it's unfolding.
business community is going to respond.
Good. Yeah. No, I think there are opportunities for CCAs, but it's an example of the complexity, the day-to-day challenges.
On that note, let's thank the speakers.